Namaskar. Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sree Iyer, and after a long hiatus, we have back with us Pandit Satish Kumar Sharma, and we're going to be talking about some very important developments taking place in England or Great Britain, United Kingdom, whatever you would like to address them as. And let's welcome Pandit Ji. Pandit Ji, Ram Ram, Jai Sri Ram, Namaskar. How are you?
Never mind, technical issue, but I think it's been resolved now. Too many windows open as happens. But just returning to your question about British democracy and the loss of parliamentarians. Only yesterday we found out that Lee Anderson, a Conservative MP, and quite a reliable, strong Conservative MP, has been dismissed. He has had the whip taken from him, so he's no longer a Conservative MP. And this is the end of several steps. If I can just share with your viewers what actually happened, it'll only take a little bit of time to set the scene. On the 21st, a motion had been put forward by one of the minor parties, so Scottish National Party, one of the minor opposition parties, put forward a motion requesting a debate on Gaza and the Israeli-Hamas conflict. Remember, the British Parliament has absolutely no influence and has no sway to be having a debate on the internal affairs of a sovereign democracy. And yet the, shall we say, the British parliamentarians felt, yes, this is something we can actually speak about. And it's worth remembering that the British Parliament has a habit of having debates and casting opinions and aspersions on the affairs of many countries. Usually countries where they have no influence whatsoever. And the reason they do this is to maintain the moral high ground of the British government. Okay, if you can stand on a moral high ground and pontificate and point to inadequacies in every single country all over the world, then it keeps your position on the moral high ground sort of entrenched. And so from the moral high ground, one of the minority parties decided we should debate what's going on in Israel, Gaza, Palestine. Now, the remarkable thing was that the motion that they put forward wasn't to the satisfaction of the Labour Party. Now, we have a special day reserved for minority parties to be able to put forward just their motions and amendments. And it was on one such day that the Scottish Nationalist Party put forward this request. It should have been very simple. The Speaker should have, under normal circumstances, as has happened for the last several hundred years, should have said, yes, it's the opposition motion, let's debate it. But then something quite strange happened, and that was that a meeting occurred between the Speaker and the leader of the Labour Party behind closed doors, after which the Speaker came and said, I'm actually going to allow the opposition, the main opposition, the Labour Party, to also put in a motion. Now, normally what happens is an opposition party like the SNP can put forward a motion, and then the government who are in office and power can ask for amendments. So really there's no participation of the main opposition whatsoever. And the fact that the Speaker allowed Labour to have a toe in was very, very strange. Ordinarily, that would have been questioned. It denied the SNP the chance of having lots of floor time to fully debate this issue. But then something else transpired. Once there was a bit of a ruckus in the House in response to his decision, he made the apology and announced that the reason that he had allowed Labour to have their interjection, their amendment, was because he had been told that if the Labour parliamentarians weren't allowed to have their voice and they had to vote on the amendment as it had been originally submitted, they could be targeted for violence. And as a result of that, the Speaker interfered and changed several hundred years of accepted process just because of an intervention from the leader of the opposition. So there are two major things that have happened there. One is that the Speaker, who is independent, interfered in support of Her Majesty's official opposition, the Labour Party. But secondly, the acceptance and the admission that his choice was motivated by fear that parliamentarians would be targeted with violence is an incredible acknowledgement. And the reason I say it's quite an incredible acknowledgement is that, remember, the only reason a parliament exists is to expend the taxation contributions of the whole population to allocate resources for their benefit. And that includes funding an army to protect the public. The second thing that parliamentarians do is that they pass laws, which can then be enforced with the use of physical force. They're the two things that any government basically undertakes. And that's the sign of a democracy. In a democracy, we all decide we're not going to be a mob. We're not going to use street power. We're not going to use thuggery and force to get our way. And we're not even going to defend ourselves and bear arms, because we give the government of the day the responsibility to do that on our behalf in a sensible manner, and we will pay for it. That's the contract between people and a democracy. And so for all of a sudden, the Speaker of the House to change parliamentary process, and the reason he gave is that parliamentarians are fearful for their well-being and safety, that means that the parliamentary situation where MPs can protect themselves and protect themselves to such a degree that they can extend that authority and power to protect the population suddenly evaporates. It's an incredible development, and everybody has just understood this. And they're now asking the question, hold on a minute, if parliamentarians are not able to protect themselves, who is it that they're not able to protect themselves from? And what does that mean for the rest of the population? And these are two major seismic paradigm shifting questions if you follow the nature and the legitimacy of any democratic government. So that's really what has happened there.
Thank you, Satish ji. But why are they so afraid? This is not an isolated instance, because there is this first-term congressman called Sree Iyer in Michigan. And when he voted for the invasion of Hamas, same thing happened. At 2 a.m., a lot of miscreants turned up at his house, and they tried to essentially, break apart a lot of things. And the police wasn't there. And then finally the police arrived, and they were still trying to tell them to don't do anything. They did not eject them, especially after they have tried to, mess up the place, doing all sorts of stuff. They didn't do anything. So this is a new police that we are seeing in the United States too, Satish ji.
Sree, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper behind this phenomenon. You know how if you look at the ocean, you have ripples which we can see on the surface, but those ripples are caused by deep currents. And it's always good to try and have a look and see what the deep currents are at play here. So if you ask the question, as I did a moment ago, who is it that parliamentarians are fearful of? Then there's only one question, and that is Islamist extremists. It's not the Buddhists, it's not the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's not the Hindus or the Sikhs or anyone like that. And this is crystal clear. And increasingly, many people have begun to make this statement that the police is actually functioning as a two-tier police. So it's not prosecuting the mob, but it is prosecuting those who are good law-abiding citizens whenever they step into the grey area. In the past, freedom of speech would have been wonderful, and if somebody said something particularly contentious, it would have been covered by freedom of speech. But now we're seeing members of the community make relatively, shall we say, even confrontational remarks, which are not illegal, and they're not criminal, and they're not hateful, but they are being censured. They are actually being targeted by the police service. So there is a question that's beginning to be asked, that one, we have parliamentarians fearful of someone. Two, we have the police being selective and operating a two-tier policing system. If you recall, when Leicester was happening and Hindu temples were being attacked, the police were standing there on the one side as bystanders. And we have a memory of that terrible video of a howling mob standing outside of a Hindu temple, screaming and shouting obscenities, and that was hate speech. And yet nothing happened as a consequence of that. Whereas we now have a parliamentarian having been removed from his position because he made a valid statement. He said, and I quote this, he said that, in his opinion, Sadiq Khan was under the control of Islamists, as was Keir Starmer, as was the Labour Party. So he mentioned 3 groups who he felt were being controlled by extremists. And if you bear in mind, control can extend to many things. Control can quite easily be influenced. It can be that you're making decisions as a result of the interests of certain lobby groups. And the continuous presence of public spaces being invaded weekend after weekend in London by one particular group, that indicates an element of control. It indicates an element of influence being exerted on the police and indeed on the state. And so he was quite entitled to make the statement that he did. And because he mentioned that he felt Keir Starmer was also guilty of the same offence, and that the Labour Party as a whole was also guilty of the same offence, it's completely irrational and irresponsible to say that Lee Anderson was acting in a manner which was Islamophobic. He clearly wasn't. Keir Starmer is not, to the best of our knowledge, a Muslim, and the Labour Party is not a Muslim party. And so he should not have been on the receiving end of such a dramatic, shall we say, response. And yet he has been removed from office. So there is a discrepancy there. And I've been digging under the surface, as I mentioned, and I think it's worth making an observation. Let me paint a scenario for you. You know how the British have been involved, as have the Americans and many European states. They've been involved in regime change. You know, we saw the attempts to make a regime change in Iraq. We've seen it with the Arab Spring. We have seen it in Ukraine, where the Americans have been engaged in several regime change activities. I would like to just play with the idea and explore, is Britain under a regime change strategy at this moment in time? Right? How does regime change work? You know, if you think about how we've experienced regime change in Bharat on a number of occasions, and it generally works in the following manner, doesn't it? You have infiltration first. You have people who are establishing centers of their religious ideology, centers of their academic ideology, as in the Confucius Institute, for example, in the United States. And so you have the seeding of the capacity to change public opinion and change consensus. So that's one aspect of it. 2, you then, I think, was a big red flag. It was a statement made, it was misattributed, but I think most people think Voltaire made it. And that is, to find out who is controlling you and ruling you, just ask yourself, who is it you can't criticize? Because if you can't criticize any particular entity without fear of the consequences, then they are wielding the power of being able to direct force in your direction. Take that into account. The third thing I'd say is take into account what I think Dr. Ratnuji coined a phrase, RULLS, where he said there is a repetitive, unceasing, low-level, systemic application of violence. And I remember him talking to me about it, and he said, the violence is always just below the level at which the state would respond. So you keep poking the state, as it were, and you create an atmosphere of tension, of fear, of a lack of certainty, and a genuine sense that something is wrong, that you're being oppressed, but you can't articulate it yet. And is that RULLS scenario present in Britain? Yes, it is. I think it is. We have the appearance all of a sudden of a group who are wanting to establish a Muslim political party. There is a website that's gone up called Muslim Vote. And so there is a sectarian dimension coming into British politics now. And so if you piece all of those things together, I think I'd like to put forward the proposition that, yes, what we're witnessing here in Britain is the classic strategy of what the British called the Great Game, which is regime change. Britain, I would suggest, it's a valid observation, Britain is under regime change at this moment in time.
Panditji, I want to draw your attention to the wife of the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. She's the daughter of Narayan Murthy. Mm-hmm. And there was a very simple picture of the father and the daughter having ice cream in a place called Corner Island. This is a very iconic place in Bengaluru. I've had ice creams in the other place called Marthahalli. There used to be one. Now it's been consumed by a big multi-storied building. But it's a beautiful place to have ice cream. Very select flavors and all that. I looked at her face. A face, it was not a face of the wife of a prime minister for once great nation. It was the face of someone who was really afraid of what next day was going to bring. And this is just my personal observation. I mean, you guys are welcome to go take a look at it. They are just having ice cream. But she looked really worried, really worried.
Yeah.
So it's like, this thing is going off the wheels. The train is about to go off the wheels. And if you happen to be traveling in the train, you would have a certain look. That's how it looked to me. Yeah.
And you've actually hit the pulse there. That's the zeitgeist. That's the feeling at this moment in time, right across the country, that something is wrong. I'd like to just add another dimension to this. The House of Commons, it was formed it began to take shape in the 13th and 14th century. And the reason it began to become formed is that the church and the aristocracy were oppressive. Okay, and the people got together and said, this is not enough. We need our voice to be taken into account. We're paying taxes, for heaven's sake, and so we should have the capacity to participate in decision making. One of the reasons that secularity came into play in the United Kingdom is that the church as a theocracy had got to a stage where it was so violent and you couldn't actually communicate with it because they were divinely inspired. You know what these toxic theocracies are like. God told me to do this, and so that's justification for whatever I'm going to do and however I'm going to do it, and there is absolutely no court of appeal when God has given the diktat. And so if you have a look at what the Commons, the House of Commons, actually represented, it represented the first manifestation of democracy in the United Kingdom. And it's been around with us, as I say. It was 1702 that it became more formal, and then it was in the 1900s that it became a fully fledged voice of the British people. And yet what we're seeing now is Britain is being targeted by another theocracy. So if you add that to what I've said, the poor British people, actually I would say the poor English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish people, they are being targeted once more by the appearance of another theocracy, a violent theocracy, a group of people who are inspired by divinity and who feel that they don't have any need or any commitment or any obligation to be bound by common law, to be bound by the practices and social structures of this country. They are executing another mission. So let's add those two things together. We have on the one hand a regime change strategy being possibly implemented. On the other hand, the culprits behind this are a theocracy, which is a terrible thing. And where is the aristocracy in all of this? Where are the lords and the ladies and the monarchy, which is supposed to provide the stability in the nation and navigate through this time? They've all been to a large degree either gagged or undermined to such a degree that they all feel what Prime Minister Sunakji's wife was expressing in the image that you have said. There is a lack of comfort. There is a lack of reliability that the future of this ship is in safe hands. I've drawn the analogy of a ship, and I see exactly what you're saying. It's where is the light and the positivity and the we're working with a vision and the nation is behind us and we're going to do great things together, all of those things that hold a nation together, we're tragically seeing them evaporate. So we have some turbulent waters. If you think of the British nation as a ship, it's almost as though there's a mutiny underway, that there is an attempt to grab hold of the tiller and direct it in a different direction. And that's probably something that I think is worth emphasizing from one other point of view. As British Hindus, the Hindu community has always been rather negligent, laissez-faire. Let somebody else guide the ship. We're just going to carry on creating the fuel and putting it into the engine room so the boat can drive forward. That's been our approach. But it would be worth reminding them that when a ship sinks, everybody who is on that boat gets wet, as in the best scenario, or sinks with the ship. And we've got an election which is coming up, and the British Hindu community, the British Indic community, the Sikh community, and everybody else, they really need to have a long and hard think about, are they just going to let this ship float around, wander around, flounder, whilst there is a coup to try and grab hold of the tiller and the direction of this ship? It's genuinely, I think, recognizable as a mutiny. So that's one dimension that we have to really reflect on this.
Panditji, I have a question for you. Recently, I was on a conversation with two people who are, one lives in Kerala, the other one is working outside, but working for causes that are Kerala-centric, especially for the Hindus. What has come up is, if you look at the newborn babies today in Kerala, 62 out of 100 are Muslims. And Malappuram was the only Muslim majority district. Today, 4 other districts adjoining Kozhikode, Calicut, Wayanad, and I'm forgetting the 4th one. They're all experiencing huge outflow migration from Malappuram into these state districts, and they in turn are inching towards becoming Muslim majority. This is invasion by population, sir.
Well,
I'm wondering if something like this is happening in UK too.
Well, there is the battle going on at the moment between ideology and reality. Right? There's a wonderful quotation that I remember, that you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality.
Yes.
Right. And I think we're getting to the stage where that is going to be, shall we say, those people who have adhered and preferred ideology to reality are going to have this rubbed into their faces very, very soon. You know, there is a lot of talk about diversity, especially across the Western Hemisphere, and how wonderful diversity is. And yet their traditions and their actions and their history is the most non-diverse history that is imaginable. I often ask very passionate, dynamic Christian theologians who preach diversity, I said, okay, well, when are you going to stop preaching to the Hindus and converting, or as I say, religious conversion is ethnocide? When are you going to stop ethnocide? When there is one Hindu left on the planet, will at that point the diversity bug sort of suddenly occur to you that actually, if we convert this last Hindu, that's a loss of diversity? And of course, it's a strategy, isn't it, to talk diversity and to practice uniformity and monochromatic ideologies. So we have to recognize this is a very, very, very real substance in and of itself. Having one particular group proliferating and creating demographic shift, in principle, there's nothing wrong with it. Right? They are human beings, and we assume that all human beings who are on a journey to explore existence and to become connected with the planet and all the wonderful things that are here, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with it. But where the alarm bells ring is when you have a shift in democratic proportions accompanied with a loss of diversity. That rings alarm bells. That's exactly what all of the fascist movements have sought, the erasure and eradication of human diversity, whether it's political, whether it's religious. It is always that notion that if there is one uniform humanity, then that's a good thing. And we know that that's not a good thing. That's the secret desire of every megalomaniac, isn't it? Global enslavement and domination. So we've got interesting times to come. But again, I would like to give a shout out and remind the Indic communities that we have been custodians of intellectual and artistic diversity more than any other nation. If you go to Bharat, it's diverse. You go 20 miles in one direction, the accent, the dialect changes. We have so many languages. We have so many ways of articulating all the beauty that arises in the heart of a human being. And so we are the most diverse tradition. And we're going to come to that time where we have to decide, is allowing non-diverse ideologies into a diverse existence and civilization a good thing or not? And of course it isn't. The reason I can say confidently, of course it's not, is that it's adharmic. Seeking monochromatic existence is a prerequisite to enslaving people. You have to get rid of their creativity. You have to get rid of their colorful clothing. You have to make them wear very drab, dark, uninspiring clothing and garments. And that's what these immature men, because by and large it's men who haven't grown up yet, that's what they seek to do. So Bharat has to step forward and respond to this. And Bharatiyas who have a civilizational connection have to step forward and respond to this everywhere, even in the lands of our Karam Bhumis. There is a threat on diversity, and we do know how to navigate this. We need to engage.
Panditji, couple of interesting takeaways that I'd like to leave for our audience, as well as Panditji, if you get the right access to data, you may want to find out how many Islamic women are visiting the fertility clinics in United Kingdom. UK is a really small area. You'll be surprised to know the answer. Because that whole debate that I had the question that I had asked was, how is it that in Kerala, there are 0 Islamic women going to the fertility clinics? Many reasons were given. I'd like to know what is happening in United Kingdom. This is true of many states in India. People are afraid. In fact, in the census of 2011 of the population in Kerala has not been revealed yet. So in other words, the damage is done. And today, like I said, the newborn babies, if 62 out of 100 are of one religion, and you can imagine what Kerala is going to be 10 years down the road. 10 years down the road. That's all it's going to take. So,
Sreeji, I'm actually by inclination and constitution quite an optimistic sort of a person, right? I have a great deal of confidence that this human being that has been created by Paramatma and Devi Bhumi for such a long time can be educated. There is not a human being who can't be helped to evolve into a more peaceful and tranquil being. You know, in our tradition, we say every child that's born is an incarnation of divinity. And what we need to do is to find a way of maintaining that divine, incredibly positive, Anand-seeking being for as long as possible. And we're not doing that. And there are people who are actively engaged in extinguishing that desire for a joyful existence at a very early age. You know, it's having large numbers is great, but there are times when I think that if we could ban religionism in its entirety for one generation, we'd change the course of human history. There is a time when human beings are vulnerable, and that's normally when we're in our infancy, from the age of about 4 to maybe 8 or 9. And that's the time when you can radicalize a person, put sanskar into there, which will take a whole lifetime to reverse. And so let's, you know, if there was a way in which we could prevent religionists from getting access to the next generation, in one generation, this whole issue of enslaving human beings without them ever knowing could even be resolved. There's one last thought that's just occurred to me from what you were saying about the democratic, the consequences to democracy of demographic shift. There is another dimension to this, and that's that I don't think enough of our people really understand what a democracy is and how valuable it is and how important it is. And how do you identify who to allow into a democratic space or not? If I can use the analogy of our favorite cricket pitch, you know, you see a cricket match and the people who enter into that cricket match have undertaken to follow certain rules. Okay, and those rules are everything. And one of those rules is that if you lose, you retire from the field. Right? The choice as to whether a democratic society can move forward or not is actually with the losers. If those who lose in democratic exchanges decide, well, we're not going to leave the field, and now that we've lost, we don't buy the laws anymore, and we're going to steal the wickets and pocket the ball and you know, get rid of the winning team, then the game is lost. And what I think we're witnessing is there are people engaging in democratic, shall we say, processes who are not democratic at all, and who have no respect nor intend to respect the systems that have been created over such a long period of time. And here in the United Kingdom, there is a tradition of debate. They tout themselves as the mother of all parliaments, that anything can be spoken about in these hallowed places. We have parliamentary privilege, that you could say whatever you wanted on the floor of the House of Lords or the House of Commons and be protected.
And yet one parliamentarian got...
And yet all of a sudden, the Speaker of the House is saying, I'm going to manipulate the debate, because if it goes in a particular direction, then we are fearful for the well-being of our members. And that is the end of a democratic engagement. So people should perhaps really start to see that what's under threat is democracy itself. What's under threat are all of the institutions, the rules, the regulations, the assumptions, the things that people have become accustomed to doing. All of them are under threat by this one little initiative. And, Paramatma has an incredible sense of irony and humor. We have the nation which has engaged in interfering in the affairs of so many other nations and made a virtue of virtue signaling, has touted how it has a right to speak about anything and everything. The BBC journalists who will happily diminish and humiliate some other relatively innocent person, all of a sudden in their home, in their backyard, they have a group of people who have said, we don't recognize any of your laws, any of your social mores, any of the behavior patterns which you deem to be respectful. We don't recognize that you have a moral high ground at all. And so the whole thing has been undermined by this one little event that happened in the House of Commons on the 21st. It has revealed something, I think, quite serious and quite dramatic.
Thank you so much, Panditji. I can ask you a lot of questions, but unfortunately, I think we should leave it at a positive note rather than asking more uncomfortable questions. But whatever I said, people have to have it in the back of their mind. I'm sure a lot of doctors are watching this video from across the world. Think about what I said. I'm not making this up. And it's a clear and present danger. Somehow one community feels that they can conquer the world in a certain way. And I would see one thing that I want to leave our viewers with is UK has some of the most generous I should say allowances for illegal immigrants that land on their shores. I thought that was stopped by Rishi Sunak. Did it not happen?
It hasn't happened, and I don't think it's likely to happen. It's almost universally accepted now that Tony Blair, in his years, opened the floodgates to immigration into this country with a very simple intention, that this was going to be their voting demographic. And if we
he's advising Biden now. Sirji, he's advising Biden now.
and we can see how his influence is causing such harmony, peace, tranquility, and prosperity in the United States as it did in the United Kingdom. This was a deliberate political act. There's absolutely no doubt about it. They thought this is an easy way to get a subservient electorate, and that's what they have done. The consequences are going to be devastating. Sreeji, I don't think people have thought it through, but just imagine that we get Keir Starmer, a prime minister who is willing to bend the knee to an organization like Black Lives Matter, okay? And this prime minister, who is influenced by the mob, is going to be sitting at the United Nations Security Council. Okay, imagine the ramifications of having somebody who is so compromised that they daren't even speak in their own chamber. What sort of a person is going, what sort of an influence is that type of a person going to have? So again, I think it's just what do we do about it? Yata ichasi tatakuru, as I've always said, our Hindu community in the United Kingdom need to wake up to the reality, not be immature and childish in the manner in which they stick to their loyalties just because they're loyal, the Gardner syndrome. And they need to take responsibility for the fact that we will all flourish, we will all drown in the same boat, and that irrespective of which nation you're in, it's our responsibility to contribute our perspective in a manner that it will be heard.
Yes, indeed. And we are now at a point, of inflection point, especially for some of these minorities. They have a disproportionately high representation in key places. That means somebody has planned all these things out. And we can scream that this is not fair, this is not just, but they just don't care. They've had
Sree,
instance,
just remember the phrase regime change, right? And
yes,
it's something that is so difficult for us to even consider, that the Western nations could be the targets of regime change. But if you accept that that is a possibility, even a remote possibility, then all of a sudden, so many of the things that you're raising and mentioning, some of the points that I've mentioned, they suddenly become reasonable, understandable, they fit into the pattern. And it's a pattern worth accepting. When you accept that
yes.
pattern, decide, everybody has to decide, do you want to be a part of that future?
Yes, indeed. And now let's take a few questions, Panditji, if you don't mind.
Please.
Partha wants to know, it is increasingly clear most Western democracies seem to be using the word bipartisan, to shove another word, uniparty, under the rug. How to solve this backseat driving?
Well, it's a great observation. Let me unpick it a little further. I would suggest that the story that we've all been told by the Western powers is worthy of revisiting. We have this idea that they were terrible, they went out into the world, they colonized the world, they created institutions, and then all of a sudden they became beneficent. They became people who wanted to genuinely shoulder the responsibility for humanity's well-being. They created the United Nations, they created the World Health Organization, blah, 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 blah. But if you actually look at the reality, a different scenario becomes apparent. I call these sham democracies. Right? Behind the facade and the drama of what happens in parliamentary debating chambers on the floor of the Senate and in Congress, there are still those entities which acquired huge wealth, power, and influence, and then created institutions for their own protection behind these sham democracies. And so what you will see is a dance between one party or another party. It's the classic magician's sleight of hand. You keep the attention of the audience in one place while the other hand is doing something nefarious or something cunning. And so this manipulation of words, uniparty, bipartisan, it's nothing other than Maya. It's nothing other than weaving stories and webs and images and tapestries in the minds of people who are, shall we say, innocent, and who are willing to accept them as reality and truth. So I would say, let's dig in deeper. Let's have a look at these sham democracies. Do also bear in mind that the colonizing powers, they also subjected their own populations to slavery. In many cases, and I often cite the British or the English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish as a classic example, they were enslaved and colonized by the British, who basically are the wealthy 1% who live in the Westminster bubble and the City of London inside of the M25, etc. They're the ones who are the custodians of the treasury, and they're the ones with the keys to the public purse, and they're the ones who are the inheritors of colonialist privilege. They're the ones who I think we have to really be most wary of.
Thank you so much, sir. Next question, please. It is great to see Panditji after a long time. How much do you think the Labour and Keir Starmer to bond more to the Islamists, to bend more to the Islamists, apart from his Israel stand in negotiations?
I think Keir Starmer it's a great question. I think Keir Starmer is in a very difficult place. He's in a very difficult place. And the reason is that the Labour Party's success is built on becoming what they called a broad church. The reality is that they said, if you are able to virtue signal a righteous cause, we want you. And so what they have done is they have created a coalition of those who are masters in victimhood peddling. And what happens when you have conflicting victimhood stories? You get caught in between a rock and a hard place. And that's where Keir Starmer is. He has, I think it was 2010, when one of the senior most ministers in the Labour Party at that time wrote an article, a public statement saying that the Labour Party is now being targeted for entryism and infiltration by Islamists, and nobody paid any attention to it. And what has happened now is that because Labour chose victimhood peddlers as its core constituency, it actually abandoned its real core constituency, which was the working class of the United Kingdom. And the working class of the United Kingdom are, I would say, if anything, even more irate now at the manner in which their party, the Labour Party that they built against Tory hegemony and against the monarchy and against the church and everybody else, that has been hijacked by a bunch of virtue signalers. And so Keir is in a very, very difficult place. I wouldn't be too surprised if we saw the breakup of the Labour Party between now and the elections. And if, heaven forbid, the Labour Party in its current form becomes the next government, I think there would still be a split afterwards. Your question about the Islamists, there have been open statements now declaring that there are 30 seats that the Muslim vote is going to target. If we are witnessing regime change, and my little hypothesis is not a total flight of fancy, imagine Labour Party success at the election. You then have 30 seats, 30 parliamentarians who have all declared their allegiance to Islam, i.e. a sectarian group. Do you really think that they're going to stay and adhere to Labour Party politics? Or will they say, actually, we're all going to go independent now? And you would then have a bloc, hypothetically, of 30 independent people in Parliament sitting on the benches, but who all have a unifying factor, and that unifying factor being a sectarian unifying factor. That's a scary prospect. So Keir Starmer he is going to have such a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. Is he an active participant in regime change, as we have been able to see, or is he genuinely going to work for the Labour core, white, working class, British and non-white working class British population? It's a question for him to answer, and I don't think he can find an answer which is comfortable for him.
Next question. With all the peaceful migration invasion in US, where do you guys think this is headed in another 10 to 20, 30 years, since it won't be easy to reverse back?
It's an incredible question, and this is a question that I think should be taxing anybody who believes in the idea of a nation state. You know, Bharat has always believed in the idea of a nation state. And I think many of the First Nations respected the idea of nation statehood. But we now have more than enough people who have absolutely no notion of a nation state. They view the world as their fiefdom, waiting for them to be the rulers on a global platform. This hasn't disappeared, by the way. You know, globalism is just another fancy word for colonialism, except it's on a global scale. There is no difference whatsoever. The same Asuric, it's the same Asuric drivers in the people who are pushing this forward. And so if we are genuinely going to see the complete disintegration of nation states, I don't think it will lead to a good place for humanity. My perspective is that a family has its own boundary, and within that boundary, the people of that family decide how they can learn, grow together, and attain a degree of safety, comfort, and prosperity. That family, if you multiply it manyfold, you have a society which works on the same basis. There is a boundary. If you then amplify it, you get a nation which is working on certain bases, and that's another boundary. So within all of these boundaries, they're safe spaces for people to be able to exert their human rights and to enjoy human life. But what we're seeing is now a conscious dissolution of all boundaries. And that is a deliberate, targeted policy. That leads to chaos. And who benefits? Those who have power and those who have wealth to be able to resist disorganized groups, large groups of populations. So I think it's a journey towards chaos, unless we can educate, unless we can influence, unless the First Nations find their voices and be able to say to this relatively new Euro-Christian Abrahamist way of living, there's a better way of existing. We have to do that. I must admit, there are times when I look at Prime Minister Modi ji's activities, and he is carrying that message that there is a better way for human beings to live on this planet. You know, we see it in the Raisina dialogues. We see Dr. Jaishankarji articulating and using the same playbook. So, yeah, it all comes back down to us. What are we going to do? What's our involvement and our contribution going to be at this time?
Thank you so much, Pariti. I don't know if you've been following what has been happening in New York City itself. The illegal migrants were staying in five-star hotels for months on end. Then one day the money ran out. They were told to go out of the five-star hotels, and they were kicking and screaming. They went out. They were supposed to be kept in shelters. For some time, schools were closed so that these people could occupy and sleep in the schools, you know, in a dining areas, a big space and things like that. Then it became too cold. Now what is happening is they're practically, you know, sleeping in front of the congressman, the mayor, and so on. And worse, what they've said is now we are going to take revenge. I don't know if that's the way I would characterize it, but what they're doing is they are peeing in cups, and these cups are being left in front of people's doors. Some are actually pooping in cups and leaving these cups on the front door. What did the average middle class American do to get this kind of a run?
Yeah. Sree, we have never had such poor quality, uneducated, emotionally deficient people in positions of power as we have at this moment in time. You know what I gently referred to as virtue signaling? We have everywhere political, powerful entities who thrive on virtue signaling rather than being virtuous. You know, anybody, it's a cheap, shallow response to be able to take a virtuous cause and start preaching it from the pulpit. Anybody can do that. And that's not really a recipe for solid political engagement or for resource allocation in any political environment. And yet that's what we're seeing. And the response that you said, it strikes me as being rather an asuric satyagraha, really, isn't it? We have a preference for more dharmic satyagraha, I would suggest, but it is at the level of the people who are being targeted. How do you get people to understand that there is a consequence when you take taxpayers' money and use it for your own flights of fancy? You know, that's the key, isn't it? And
literally and figuratively, that has happened, sir.
Yeah. And we have it here all the time. The British are doing this all the time. In fact, the BBC is the biggest virtue signaling megaphone I think history has ever recorded. And the reality is that sooner or later the chickens come home to roost. And if all you have is 5 years of virtue signaling, which hasn't translated into profitable, prosperous policy, then there is a consequence. I'm just thinking back to the Iceland scenario, where after the crash of 2008, the Icelandic population actually went into their parliament, seized the parliamentarians physically, dragged them out and put them into rubbish bins. They literally put their parliamentarians into rubbish bins. They reconstituted their own parliament using teachers, truckers, you know, genuine workers as representatives of their community. And it's been a very successful parliament. So there's a great reset, but I don't think it's a reset of the type that the gentlemen and gentle ladies of the 𝗣𝗽 in Davos have really expected.
Yes, indeed. Panditji, I think we'll have to take this as the last question because I have another program coming up in 5 minutes and I need to switch gears because I have to start speaking and thinking in Hindi. So I beg your pardon for this. Anup Agarwal, thank you so much for becoming a YouTube member. And Thought Provocateur, thank you so much. Democracy with God Save the King national anthem.
I think the royal family and their difficulties are a whole program in their own right. The old power structures, like I mentioned, are collapsing. The idea of the monarchy has really been almost lost because they're not credible anymore. The fairy story has become very jaded. It's the same with Parliament and its pomp and circumstance. All of that is corroding, cracks are appearing. And it will genuinely, I think, be a difficult time. But on the other end of it, there could be a real democracy in the United Kingdom. Maybe we could replace all of this paraphernalia with a blockchain website and just let human beings vote for each and every motion. Why not? It's not beyond technology. And I think that would be a better step forward than what we currently have.
Yes, indeed. And what a wonderful exposition of thoughts here. And really, we need you more often on our channel, Panditji. And I say this thing with all humility because you bring in a perspective that many of us perhaps don't even dare to go there, because we're all caught up in our own internal wars. We fight this thing, challenges, what have you. But Indian diaspora in particular, they are so driven to succeed that sometimes they don't see the storm that is brewing around them. And this is where I have the biggest fear, that we are like, being slow cooked. And as a frog, it can't get out after being in water for hours on end because the muscles are too weak now.
Sreeji, Dharma is rising. I said in 2013 that Dharma was beginning to rise. And I look back at that time and, since that time, our influence on the planet has increased dramatically. It needs to be much, much more. But I'm absolutely confident that once our civilizational voice starts to connect, starts to reconnect, becomes more stable, starts to really accept a bit of responsibility, finally we will see the day when we are a Hanumanji personality who has forgotten what our true strength is. And it'll only take, I would say, another 10% in our population to start to realize how powerful we are and how powerful we are in a very holistic and a dharmic manner. We can change all of this, and we will do. We have rebuilt the economies around the world. We have participated in every frontier of academic excellence. We look after health and well-being and finance. The only spaces left, there are two spaces left. One is politics and the other is religion. And we need to be present in both of those. We have so much to contribute.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, sir. Namaskar.
It's a pleasure. Jai Shri Ram. And remember, regime change. That's what's happening. Okay. Thank you, Sreeji. A pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.